Israel launches a gutsy airstrike on Hamas targets in Qatar. Now, while the immediate outcome is unclear, the implications are considerable. Commentators are torn. Is this restoring international norms or breaking all the acceptable rules of sovereignty and legitimacy? First, what happened? Well, on September 9th, Israel surprised just about, everybody by striking a Hamas compound in Doha, Qatar. The operation came a day after Hamas-affiliated gunmen boarded a bus and murdered 6 Israeli civilians and wounded dozens in the largest terrorist attack in Jerusalem in months. The Israeli strike was aimed at killing Hamas's top leadership and ended up killing, at least we confirm, several Hamas operatives and perhaps a Qatari security officer. Hamas and Qatar say the top leadership survived, although we have yet to see proof. Prime Minister Netanyahu defended the operation, warning Qatar to expel Hamas leaders in the months and especially in the days before the operation, or that Israel would do it themselves. Hamas leaders in Doha were involved in ceasefire talks, but had already rejected multiple US-backed ceasefire offers, and were set or expected to reject the latest Israeli demands and US proposal once again. What's the key block in the negotiations? Well, it's simple. Hamas doesn't want this war to end. It wants to rest, it wants to regroup, it wants to rearm, and then it wants to launch another October 7th style attack on its terms and when it's ready. Most importantly, it's rejecting Israel's key demands, which are now backed by most of the Arab countries, including Qatar itself, that Hamas must disarm and Hamas cannot be in charge of Gaza going forward. Of course, Qatar condemned the strike as a violation of its sovereignty and said that it undermined its role as a mediator. The Gulf countries, including the UAE, condemned Israel's strike, or at least pretended to, and while reports said that the US was notified, and even that the US notified the Qataris, all sides are now insisting that this was a unilateral Israeli move. It's interesting to note, by the way, that none of the Arab states condemned Israel going after Hamas leaders, rather that they violated Qatari and GCC sovereignty and airspace in the process. Now let's look at the bigger context. Hamas abroad has long enjoyed safe haven in Qatar. It raises funds, it directs operations from what some called its diplomatic embassy. This strike was clearly meant to send a message. Hamas may have lost key operatives and Qatar suffered humiliation as a host and mediator, although it insists that it will remain in the role should it be asked to do so. Others are suggesting that this signals that Israel and possibly the US are done with Qatar as a mediator, who has been ineffective to this point in using its leverage to push Hamas into a deal, and that role could now move to Egypt. This was a gutsy move on Israel's part. It's a political and strategic gamble and not without risks. It was meant to ramp up the pressure, but it could drive Hamas away from negotiations altogether, rather than push them into accepting Israel's demands, i.e., accept surrender. It could also bolster Israel's already tarnished reputation as having lost all semblance of playing by the rules, ever the rogue actor, as opposed to a calculated actor using force smartly. It could also, unfortunately, seal the fate of the hostages, 20 of whom are thought to be still alive, languishing and starving in Hamas's torture dungeons deep underground. These are risks we hope Israeli leaders and intelligence took into consideration before approving this operation. There are also rumors going around that the strikes were actually even coordinated and possibly planned with the Gulf countries, including Qatar itself, as a way to elegantly expel Hamas and finally crack down on Hamas and other extremist Muslim Brotherhood-linked terrorist organizations without getting the regional pushback in public opinion. And this theory would make a lot of sense if it's true. Now let's look at some of the bigger implications. The question is Israel becoming, or already, a loose cannon, an uncontrollable rogue actor who only views problem solving through the scope of a gun? Or is Israel, as happened with Iraq's nuclear program in 1981, Syria's nuclear program in 2007, and Iran's nuclear program in 2005, not to mention Israel's very successful pushback and dismantlement, essentially, of Hezbollah and Hamas, a sense of restoring order to a broken system, and that Israel will ultimately be thanked, for now behind the scenes, but eventually publicly, by the regional powers. You see, Qatar and the revisionist actors in the international system are trying to portray Israel's act as a violation of Qatari sovereignty. One journalist on international television even asked me if this doesn't open the door for any country to go after their enemies or opponents on another country's sovereign territory. And if this begs the question of what is the meaning of sovereignty to begin with? Is Israel breaking all the rules of the international system once again? Or is it possible that Israel is restoring a sense of order to an international system that has been cynically abused by such rogue actors? Does it make more sense that Qatar shouldn't have been hosting Hamas terrorists to begin with, who direct Hamas terror operations, including October 7th, who wage Hamas's media and narrative war against Israel and the West, including via Qatari media assets, and who fundraise via Qatar? Could that be more of the problem? And if Qatar was hosting Hamas in order to keep an eye on them, as we're being told, and be able to pressure them, then perhaps that value is lost when Qatar can't or won't pressure Hamas to end this war and release the hostages. Perhaps Israel's critics are right. Perhaps this was reckless, one-dimensional, and short-sighted. Perhaps this is a gamble that goes wrong. Perhaps Israel should have been more coordinated and presented a more complex but patient effort with the US and its GCC partners. And perhaps it did all this, and this is all just part of a deception campaign. But perhaps, as we have learned retroactively, time and again over the last decades, and especially the last 2 years, that when the international system only serves the rogue states who are ready to break the rules, then sometimes a hard reset is needed. And if such states don't see a problem with hosting and protecting a vile terrorist group, then the threat of being on the pointy end of an Israeli or an American missile might make them think differently and reconsider who they host.